It's no exaggeration to say that the 1940s were some of the most turbulent times in all of history, with World War II coming to a head and involving essentially every major nation across the globe. The conflict would reshape every society involved. But it's not just governments and leaders that were impacted by World War II. A conflict of this scale had a trickle-down effect on every aspect of the major superpowers that were. For the United States, this meant a reshaping of the means of production in the entertainment industry and its very purpose, as men, women, resources, and the films they made were all put to work in the effort against the Axis powers. And there's one movie studio that shifted into an entirely new direction for almost a decade, limiting what it could make and also becoming a key player in the propaganda side of battle: Walt Disney Productions. From 1943 through 1949, the company went through what is now known as the Wartime Era of Disney, a period when the company made dozens of shorts either cobbled together into feature films or used in the anti-Axis war effort. Sandwiched between the classics of Bambi and Cinderella, these creations are often forgotten by time, either due to a lack of interest or the Disney Company itself sweeping them under the rug. In the decades since, some of these shorts have become mini classics of their own, as the company has lifted them and repurposed them in other productions. But the majority are the forgotten pieces of a time where Disney barely had the funds or means to stay alive, as the entire world became engulfed in conflict. How exactly did Walt Disney Productions become involved in World War II? And what is the legacy of this time when the company made everything but their most beloved films? This is Disney at War. We begin our story in 1941 and the end of my first Disney video this year with the release of Fantasia. Fantasia had been Walt Disney's most ambitious project to date, a classical music symphony of sound and image, where painstakingly animated short films brought a curated selection of songs to life on screen. And it wasn't just the film that was ambitious, its distribution was as well, with Disney creating a 13-city roadshow for Fantasia, with each theater equipped with new Fantasound for the best audio experience possible, and plans to turn the film into a constantly touring experience with new segments swapped in and out for years to come. The expense of the production was met head-on with the international spread of World War II, meaning Fantasia couldn't be distributed internationally. And when the US officially entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Fantasia's distribution came to an end, turning the $2.28 million film into a financial disaster. Disney was in financial trouble, and while Dumbo and Bambi performed much better at the box office, their budgets were far smaller than Fantasia, with Dumbo in particular only an hour long because Walt himself said he couldn't afford it to be any longer. Still, their initial releases were essentially cut off from being distributed at all in Europe due to the war. Inside the studio, the financial struggles soon led to massive layoffs of animators. When combined with what many saw as unequal treatment among the staff, calls for unionization grew and grew. In turn, Disney called for a meeting of his animators, telling them, "Put your own house in order. You can't accomplish a damn thing by sitting around and waiting to be told everything. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling and growling, do something about it." Well, that backfired, as half of the remaining 1,000 artists went on strike for 5 weeks in 1941, joining the Screen Cartoonists Guild and organizing with several other unions to create a picket line around Disney's productions. And what do you know? The solidarity worked, because that's what solidarity does. And the US National Labor Relations Board pushed for Disney to sign a union contract, leading to equal pay, a better pay structure, and fair procedures for Disney's animators. Although Walt always held a grudge against the union members from that day forward, later testifying to the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Red Scare and blaming communism for the strike. Sure, Walt, it was the commies and not the unfair treatment that did it. Anyway, in the months leading up to the US entering World War II, Walt Disney Productions was a mess. Not only had they lost a ton of money, but Roy Disney simply couldn't get any investors to help financially support the studio. But the war would bring new opportunities to Disney and greater limitations than ever. While the Pearl Harbor attack officially entered the United States into combat during World War II, the truth is that the country was deeply involved long before that, providing military supplies to the Allies and creeping toward war. Outside of immediate conflict, much of the country's interest in other nations was shaped by President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, a principle of non-interventionism toward Latin America, meaning that after several military interventions during the early 20th century, the US would no longer participate in conflict in Central and South America, but instead work to cooperate and create trade agreements with Latin nations, to influence through commerce instead of military. Okay, so what does this have to do with Disney? Well, kinda everything. A major element of the non-interventionist strategy was to get Hollywood productions much more involved with Latin American countries and Latino movie stars, hoping to eliminate stereotypes and portray these countries as exciting and desirable. The biggest star of this movement was Brazilian actress, singer, and dancer Carmen Miranda, who became such a key figure that she was voted as the third most popular personality in the United States in 1939. By the end of the 30s, the US government had become especially concerned with Nazi powers influencing Latin American countries, leading to the Good Neighbor policy becoming focused on strengthening US relations and currying favor through commerce and art. And of the several different studios that became part of the effort, Disney was one of the most important. In August of 1941, in the midst of the strike, Walt Disney and 17 others from the studio that came to be known as El Grupo traveled to South America as a US envoy. With Disney's films already a hit throughout the region, forging relations was much easier for El Grupo, who both attended regional events across the continent and, in turn, studied the various cultures to create Latin American-focused films. The result was two features, Saludos Amigos in 1943 and The Three Caballeros in 1945, both known as package films, aka anthologies, with a focus on Latin America and heavily featuring Donald Duck, who was already a popular character on the continent. As a side note, I think it's really fascinating to see how various Disney characters become massive hits in different countries around the world, and begin to take on lives of their own outside of the major US Disney productions. Donald Duck is super popular in the Nordic countries of Europe, with the Danish comic Anders And, as well as the Swedish comic Kalle Anka & Co., having decades worth of stories that are only now being reprinted in English. Also, Mickey Mouse has been super popular in Italy for decades, with the Topolino comic being his publication of choice in the area. For Disney, Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros would need to serve several purposes at once. Be popular in South America, educate US audiences about Latin American culture, and push positive relations between the many different countries to counteract Axis influence without explicitly saying so. Saludos Amigos is the most obvious in its efforts, as it features live-action footage of El Grupo visiting various countries and detailing the real-life Good Neighbor visit, with 4 segments that blend live-action and animation as a travelogue that reveals their distinct cultures. Bolivia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil are all featured, as the narrator details different distinct aspects of the countries and their major cities, with Donald meeting new character Jose Carioca during his adventures. There's not really any real story, and, in essence, each country is boiled down to its most colorful and whimsical aspects in an effort to portray them as positively as possible, even if it plays into stereotypes that have come to define South America. But this is, after all, literal propaganda. Saludos Amigos from 1942 was commissioned by the US Department of State and funded by a federal loan to counteract the studio's near bankruptcy at the time. See, propaganda doesn't necessarily mean that it attacks a group or that it's a lie, but that it has a real-world agenda that it's working to persuade its audience about, most often in service to a government's goals. Saludos Amigos is propaganda in service to international goodwill, but the government backing of it means there's an official war-related meaning for this feature film. The Three Caballeros from 1944 is a little less explicit in its goals, but serves a similar purpose. Now with Donald getting birthday presents from his Latin American friends, including a returning Jose and the new Mexican rooster Panchito Pistoles. Yes, also a stereotype. Now, the countries are Peru, Ecuador, Brazil, and Mexico, with a lot of song and dance that brings together live action and animation, with Donald being disturbingly horny for a lot of human women. Overall, I'd say The Three Caballeros is a lot more impressive than Saludos, with some incredible animation and the live-action combination being pretty fun, alongside some good song and dance. These would be the 2 feature films made by Disney during the war, but the studio had so much more involvement than just this. The day after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the US Army moved into Disney Studios. I know what you're thinking. Okay, why? Disney didn't attack the base? Well, it's more a coincidence than anything. Disney Studios was located near several key aircraft factories, and their safety became a major priority in the area. And with the studio being the largest nearby location that could house military personnel and equipment, Disney Studios became the only movie studio to be occupied by the US military. For the next 8 months, the studio housed 500 troops, with the soundstage used for equipment repairs and parking lots storing ammo. Walt Disney Productions suddenly had very little access to the facility it depended on to make films, and over the next 4 years, 90% of the staff would be focused on creating propaganda and educational films for the US war effort. The vast majority of what the studio would make is educational and training films, used by every branch of the US government to prepare staff and troops for the war, totaling hundreds of hours and rarely seen today. And here's the thing, none of these shorts are available on Disney+. In fact, the vast majority of Disney's early shorts aren't available on their streaming platform, with only the most apolitical and inoffensive works added to the site. The most straightforward propaganda shorts include Reason and Emotion, an examination of the two supposed halves of the human consciousness that heavily inspired Inside Out, and veering into a discussion of how Hitler preyed on people's emotions to gain power. Education for Death, a 3-act dissection of the Nazi influence in Germany that works to ignite anger toward how Nazis slowly corrupt young minds, is maybe the most effective and most direct of any of these. The Thrifty Pig, All Together, and 7 Wise Dwarfs, made for the National Film Board of Canada, essentially repurpose existing animation with some palette swaps to make some characters into Nazis, or to place the animation in different contexts. These are extremely low effort and low cost, the seams of their changes showing with lots of bond-buying language slapped on at the end to drive the point home. Others serve a very direct purpose regarding specific government departments or needs. Stop That Tank is part lampooning of Hitler and mostly anti-tank rifle instructional video. Food Will Win the War supports the Department of Agriculture. The New Spirit and The Spirit of 43 were requested by the Treasury Department to convince US citizens of the importance of taxes to support the military efforts, both starring Donald Duck as a first-time taxpayer, with most of these cartoons taken up by the painstaking tax form fill-out process, and detailing the many types of weapons it will pay for.
Taxes to bury the Axis.
Out of the Frying Pan into the Firing Line has many teach the importance of saving grease at home. The Few Quick Facts series was specifically made for soldiers and covered topics ranging from safety, to the GI Bill of Rights, to diarrhea, to the Japanese. Meanwhile, Victory Through Air Power was a 65-minute partially animated documentary adapting the book of the same name. The difference was this was entirely Walt Disney's idea, with the founder wanting to push author Alexander P. de Seversky's idea that long-range bombing was critical for winning the war. So Walt personally financed the film in an effort to convince Roosevelt of Seversky's ideas. And it worked, pushing the US and Britain to develop more bomber planes and ground-penetrating bombs. As you'll notice, Donald is the only Disney character to be featured more than once in these shorts, and as a result, he became a face of the United States during the war, being featured on hundreds of patches worn by soldiers. Outside of the tax shorts, Donald starred in Donald's Decision, Commando Duck, The Vanishing Private, Home Defense, Fall Out, Fall In, The Old Army Game, Donald Gets Drafted, Sky Trooper, and Der Fuhrer's Face. In most of these, Donald actually has a completely unglamorous experience. He panics, he suffers, he's often nearly killed, all in service to the US military. But Der Fuhrer's Face is wild, with Donald having a nightmare of being a citizen of Nazi Germany and struggling to keep up with the factory he works in. It's essentially Donald in Math Magic Land, except everyone's a dirty, stinking Nazi. Given that most of these shorts were shown in theaters for the general American or Canadian public, they aren't designed to support active soldiers, who instead watch the many instructional videos made by Disney. Instead, these have very specific purposes for civilians. Keep morale up at home, encourage participation in the military, and push for war bond buying. In watching these shorts to understand more about Disney's output at the time and relation to the war, a thought struck me. Propaganda, no matter how effective or morally correct, will only ever create temporary change in the world and may even lead to backlash once we see that the stereotypes on display are incorrect, leading to people disillusioned with the messaging to instead adopt the beliefs that were being fought against. In the event that actual education is cast aside in favor of propaganda, the lessons we learned decades ago are lost. It's really fascinating to watch these shorts in the context of Disney today. The common empty-headed critique of the company is that it's woke now, and yet consuming an endless wave of products from a massive corporation is about the least woke thing a person could ever do. If anything, Disney is extremely safe these days, with each new show and movie designed to appeal to the consumer base they feel will be their largest supporter. And that's really the case during World War II as well. The country needed propaganda and educational films, so that's simply what the company provided. Of course, not every short produced by the studio at the time was government propaganda. Silly Symphonies had ended in 1939 after 75 entries, and in their place was a larger variety of shorts. Really, shorts were Disney's biggest output during the 40s, due to their lower investment and risk. For many financiers, these were the only types of creations they'd be willing to support after the major financial crash of the studio and the general lean times of the war. But this also extended past the war's end. The war may have been over, but the studio's hardships weren't. With the company essentially living from piece to piece and all those shorts for the government done for cost and not for profit, Disney's finances hadn't really improved. Looking to the future and the types of movies they would make, Walt said, "We're through with caviar. From now on, it's mashed potatoes and gravy." And one of the first to be made was the most controversial Disney film of all time, Song of the South. Released in 1946 and using a blend of live action and animation, it's never included in the wartime era and depicts an idealized vision of the Reconstruction era in the US. In the years since, Song of the South has basically been erased from the Disney records, not wanting to perpetuate the stereotypes and alternative history presented by the film. But make no mistake, Song of the South was also lambasted by civil rights activists at the time of its release too. This is not a new phenomenon. This is a movie that was offensive right when it was released. Post-war Disney produced 4 more animated feature films: Make Mine Music in 1946, Fun and Fancy Free in 1947, Melody Time in 1948, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad in 1949. All of these are package films without any overarching narrative or really any connective tissue. George Romero's Creepshow, these are not. And I think it's very telling that the Disney wartime era actually extends far past the actual end of World War II. VJ Day may have happened on September 2nd, 1945, and brought the war to a close, but the wartime era ended in 1949. And like the previous 2 government-backed films, these are all essentially the byproduct of the studio not having enough finances to create a single, more expensive feature film. Instead, these are all composed of multiple shorts, ranging from 10 in Make Mine Music to 2 in The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. But overall, I would say that the vast majority of these segments are pretty forgettable. Make Mine Music in particular is composed of several discarded ideas, originally intended to be new segments in the continually shifting Fantasia Roadshow, with Peter and the Wolf dramatizing the famous musical composition, and The Whale Who Wanted to Sing at the Met being a surprisingly dark story of, well, a whale who wanted to sing at the Met, but actually just being the death dream of said whale, harpooned before realizing his fantasy. Ain't that just the way? Fun and Fancy Free brings Jiminy Cricket back as the narrator, tying the segments of Bongo the Bear, a love-struck dummy who falls off a train, and Mickey and the Beanstalk, one of the more famous pieces from this era as a whole, together. Melody Time is more focused on American tales like Johnny Appleseed and Pecos Bill, and boy is it boring. And with The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad solely split between 2 stories, each based on well-loved pre-existing tales, and both given ample time to become fully fleshed out, it's probably the strongest of the bunch, and the only one to gain a place in larger Disney media. With The Adventures of Mr. Toad getting a ride in Disneyland, with Train Crash, Death, and Hell Visit now added to Scar the Kids, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow becoming a Halloween mainstay. And really, those last 10 minutes with the Headless Horseman chase are incredible. Easily some of the best animation of the wartime era as Disney began to regain its financing. But largely, most of these have been lost to time, even when preserved by DVD, Blu-ray, and streaming reproductions. Those that weren't plucked out of the larger films and onto VHS collections in the 80s and 90s have no real fandom. No one is trading pins of Little Toot. The 2 silhouettes aren't getting a place of honor on the next Disney parade. And I think this largely points toward Disney's goal during the wartime era: survival. The package films gave the studio something for its animators to work on, and something to put in theaters that would hopefully make a profit against their minuscule budgets. The propaganda shorts were meant to rally the United States in the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. Their goals of portraying the Axis as vile enemies and getting US citizens to pay taxes, enlist, and stay strong are all right there on the surface. And survive Disney did. With Cinderella released in 1950, full-length animated feature films were back on the table, with a return to princesses and fairy tales, finding major success and beginning the Silver Age of Disney. And with the opening of Disneyland in 1955, the company would begin to grow in brand new ways. It's an era of highs and lows for the studio, marked by Walt Disney's biggest passion project in Sleeping Beauty being met with poor sales, the switch to xerography to stay in business, and the death of Disney leading to ongoing turbulence at the studio in the Disney Dark Age. But for all those struggles, those are films that each have passionate fans that grew up with them, and have passed them on to the next generations. The wartime era simply doesn't have that same legacy. All those propaganda films had a purpose they fulfilled, and in the 8 decades since, have lived on as more of a relic than an actual piece of art to be appreciated. The package films have moments of brilliance, and some segments have been able to transcend their contexts. But by and large, these are movies made to keep a studio afloat instead of a true work of creativity and innovation. And the further we get from the era, the happier Disney seems to be in leaving these creations in the past. Whether you think they should be left behind is up to you, but for a time, this was how Disney fought the war, and they lived to fight another day. Thanks for watching today's video, and my return to another era of Disney animation. And like you've probably seen on my other videos on animation such as Don Bluth and the Thief and the Cobbler, as well as the death of the Disney Renaissance, I'm always most interested in animation in times of struggle, and the creations that are often overlooked and left behind. So the wartime era of Disney is something that I often see overlooked, because most of these films and shorts have really been left behind. Which I really do understand, as so much of this was of the time, is often offensive because of its stereotypes, and had a very specific purpose to serve and really isn't applicable to most other times. Still, I think it's fascinating, and I loved revisiting it and watching a lot of shorts I'd never seen before. I logged a whole lot of World War II propaganda on my Letterboxd recently, and that might have confused a few people. But overall, it was a wild time, and I thought it was really fascinating to experience. Disney has gone through a lot of different eras and a lot of different focuses as a company, but none of them are like the wartime era. And so as Draper continues, I thought it was a perfect time to go back to another Disney-focused video. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the wartime era of Disney. What shorts or even segments of larger films you really do like from this period? And what do you think about this often overlooked time in the studio's history? A lot of these aren't available on Disney Plus, but have been restored and are largely available in different places online. So check those out if any of this interested you. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a patron, it's only $1 a month for early access to every video, and exclusive Patreon-only reviews, including a year-end Q&A I'm putting up exclusively for my Patreon. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves, and checking out the more obscure side of animation.